All right, folks, today we're going to continue our discussion with the fall of Rome, talking about all of the many things that contributed to the destruction of this great empire. Now, I want you to understand something. The fall of Rome was officially declared done and over when the last Roman emperor died in 476 AD. So 476 years after Christ was born. We know that Rome was around in like 76 BC. So 500 years of a country. We're at 250 in the United States. So when you talk about a large empire collapsing, this didn't happen quickly. It took a great many years to begin crumbling, and it wasn't until the last emperor died in 476 and they never replaced him that they finally said it was the end of an empire. Now, when you think about something like that, if you were to put one reason on something as big as a country falling apart or losing its power, you can't do it. There's no possible way that you can attribute it to just one thing. So as we mentioned a little bit yesterday or earlier this week when you came up with causes and effects for different things that could contribute to the fall of an empire, we're going to continue discussing all of the possible things that contributed to the decline. So here is Rome at its peak, and you can see that if we were to superimpose the United States over the top of this, it would be just about the same size. Obviously, they've got all this water in between, so not quite as much land mass as the United States, but a considerable size. And Rome, right here in Italy, the capital city, was very, very, very far. Think about this. If Rome's here, that's like being in, I don't know, Colorado, and then having to go all the way to California or all the way to New York. That's quite a distance, especially when we don't have easy transportation like airplanes and cars and things like that. So to get from place to place in this empire is going to be a great challenge, having this be as big as it is. All right, so one of the first problems that led to the decline was a religious conflict. Now, we talked a couple weeks ago about Christianity and how the Romans at first were very reluctant because they felt threatened by the Christians. They didn't like the fact that they wouldn't practice honoring Roman gods. And so there was lots of conflict. Well, we're past that time now. Constantine and Diocletian have accepted Christianity as a religion, so it's not that type of conflict anymore. That's leading to the decline of this empire. But one of the problems was that the beliefs were still different than a lot of people, and they wouldn't fight in wars. They had very peaceful beliefs. And so they refused military service. And when barbarians, which were outside countries, were threatening Rome, Christians refused to step up and help. So that caused a conflict, perhaps even decreasing the amount of soldiers available to fight. They also citizens were giving money to the church instead of the government. They wanted to support the church, and so there was less money to repair cities and build up things that the government could give. Also, a lot of the really intelligent leaders who would have made great emperors or great senators or any of those types of positions became religious leaders. And so think about if all of the smart people go do one job, we don't have lots of smart people left to do other jobs. So if all the smart people became doctors, we wouldn't have smart people to become lawyers, or not as many. So that was a problem. All right, next, excessive military spending. Now, excessive means more than necessary. And this was a huge problem mostly because of the size of Rome, like I showed you at the beginning. The borders were very far from the center of the empire, and there were a lot of borders. There was lots of edges to this country. Not only did they have to protect the borders on land, but they had to protect that interior part, sea travel and things like that. There weren't enough Romans to serve in the military, so they hired mercenaries. They paid money to people from outside of Rome to come in and protect the country. Now think about this. If you had to fight a fire to defend your home, think about how hard you'd work to put out that fire. You move heaven and earth to put out that fire. But if you were, being paid and it wasn't a lot of money and somebody said, come on, my house is on fire, I'll give you $1 to help me, you might care and you might try for that dollar, or however much they said they'd pay you, but it's not the same as fighting for your own. So it's like going to a football game and cheering for a team that you don't really care about. So they don't have their heart into it. Lots of money went to feed, train, and house the military, so then they didn't have as much money to spend. The government didn't have as much money to spend on other things like housing the poor, feeding the poor, increasing the city and things like that, making it improved. And so therefore, taxes went up. So that's going to affect everybody, isn't it? It's going to affect anybody who has a business or owns a home. They're going to have more money that they have to spend, which means it has to come from somewhere. Inflation. This is a hard one to explain, and I want to take a couple of minutes to make sure you understand what inflation means before I explain how it affected Rome. Now, when we print paper money, remember, people in the ancient times, they had coins. They didn't have paper money. But in our country, when we print paper money, it's supposed to be based on something. Yep, it's special paper with special ink and things like that, but if anybody ever came to our country and said, I don't want this anymore, I want the gold, it's supposed to have an equal value. So $1 of paper money is supposed to have the equal amount of gold put away safely somewhere in the country. That kind of ended a long time ago, and Rome was one of the first countries to do something called debase their money. So the base unit or the base material that made their coins were either silver or gold. And so 1 denarii of silver would have been made purely of silver, and it would have been the correct size to indicate this is how much a denarii would be. So that sort of thing. So when they needed more money, but they didn't have more silver, they couldn't just make more coins. So what they did was they mixed other metals in there, and that meant that there was less silver in the coin for its value. So now you've got a denarii of silver that only has 1/4 of the amount of silver in it. So what happens then? Prices go up. I still need 1 denarii worth of silver, or gold as this says. So I have to charge you 4 denarii instead of 1 denarii because that's what I need. And so prices have to go up. The money's not worth as much. So eventually, real close to the end of the Republic or the empire, they just went back to trade. So the very first type of economy that we talked about with all of their early civilizations, they just decided, this money doesn't mean anything to me. It doesn't have any value, but this sheep does. So I'll trade you this sheep for that grain, kind of thing. So they went back to that type of economy, which was very slow and not as effective. Unemployment. So you can imagine if the money is not as valuable and they're trading and things like that, there's going to be an increase in unemployment. But that wasn't the only reason. There were large farms and small farms. Now we know that we've talked a lot about the patricians, the rich people, and the plebeians or plebeians, the poor or middle class people, and they were very, very divided. The rich were very, very rich, the poor were very, very poor. And the latifundia, or the large farms, had slave labor. So you didn't have to pay a slave. You housed them and you fed them, but you didn't pay them. So the poor farmers who couldn't afford to pay slaves and just worked on their own, their families were the employees, their crops cost more money. They couldn't sell them. They had to sell them for a lot of money to make it worthwhile. But the large farms could raise a lot more and they could lower prices. So the poor farmers went out of business. They just couldn't afford to compete. It's kind of like Walmart competing against a department store. You can't buy a white t-shirt at Kohl's for $3 most of the time, but you certainly can at Walmart. There's really not a way to compete because prices can be so much lower because a store like Walmart is so much bigger and so many more of them than something like, say, a downtown boutique, a privately owned boutique or something like that. So the unemployed farmers, they left the farms, they came to the cities. They were looking for work, there wasn't work. So they started to need handouts and the government to take care of them. So the government had to ship in lots of grain to feed everybody. They had a huge amount of homeless and things like that as a result of unemployment. Urban decay. Decay means to fall apart, to get not as, to like think about food decaying, okay? So because the poor could only afford cheap apartments, the insula, or they couldn't afford anything at all, the streets became very unsafe. Those insula were very dirty, they were very unsafe, they were crowded, disease spread very quickly, fires spread very quickly in the insula, so they weren't safe. And if you couldn't afford to live in an insula, you lived out on the streets, so then there was a higher crime rate because you were just fighting to survive. So you were stealing food, you were breaking into homes, you were robbing people. And so the safety became a concern. And political corruption. Once the empire came to be, the republic was over, they weren't electing officials anymore, they had emperors, and they never really knew who was going to be next. It wasn't like a king taking his son to become the next leader. And so if an emperor was disliked or not trusted, they'd assassinate him. At one point in history, 47 out of 60 emperors were assassinated. Over the course of all of Rome, 20% of the emperors were assassinated. And so think about the corruption involved in bribing somebody to help you, bribing somebody to make laws for you, and then killing them if you don't agree with what they've decided or what they've established as a governmental law or rule. So it was very unpredictable, very unstable, very unsafe, and you couldn't really count on the leader because you didn't know how long he was going to last. All right, so that's just a little touch on some of the other things that could have led to the fall of Rome. And tomorrow we will be discussing some categories of Rome's decline and what eventually contributed to